1 Samuel chapter 18, verse 1. After David had finished talking with Saul, he met Jonathan, the king's son. There was an immediate bond between them, for Jonathan loved David. Verse 2. From that day on, Saul kept David with him and wouldn't let him return home. Verse 3. And Jonathan made a solemn pact with David because he loved him as he loved himself. Verse 4. Jonathan sealed the pact by taking off his robe and giving it to David, together with his tunic, sword, bow, and belt. Verse 5. Whatever Saul asked David to do, David did it successfully. So Saul made him a commander over the men of war, an appointment that was welcomed by the people and Saul's officers alike. Verse 6. When the victorious Israelite army was returning home after David had killed the Philistine, women from all the towns of Israel came out to meet King Saul. They sang and danced for joy with tambourines and cymbals. Verse 7. This was their song: Saul has killed his thousands, and David his 10,000s. Verse 8. This made Saul very angry. What's this? He said. They credit David with 10,000s and me with only thousands. Next, they will be making him their king. Verse 9. So from that day on, Saul kept a jealous eye on David. Verse 10. The very next day, a tormenting spirit from God overwhelmed Saul, and he began to rave in his house like a madman. David was playing the harp as he did each day, but Saul had a spear in his hand. Verse 11. And he suddenly hurled it at David, intending to pin him to the wall. But David escaped him twice. Verse 12. Saul was then afraid of David, for the Lord was with David and had turned away from Saul. Verse 13. Finally, Saul sent him away and appointed him commander over 1,000 men, and David faithfully led his troops into battle. Verse 14. David continued to succeed in everything he did, for the Lord was with him. Verse 15. When Saul recognized this, he became even more afraid of him. Verse 16. But all Israel and Judah loved David because he was successful at leading his troops into battle. Verse 17. One day Saul said to David, I am ready to give you my older daughter Merab as your wife, but first you must prove yourself to be a real warrior by fighting the Lord's battle. For Saul thought, I will send him out against the Philistines and let them kill him rather than doing it myself. Verse 18. Who am I, and what is my family in Israel, that I should be the king's son-in-law? David exclaimed, my father's family is nothing. Verse 19. So when the time came for Saul to give his daughter Merab in marriage to David, he gave her instead to Adrai, a man from Mahalath. Verse 20. In the meantime, Saul's daughter Michal had fallen in love with David, and Saul was delighted when he heard about it. Verse 21. Here is another chance to see him killed by the Philistines. Saul said to himself, but to David he said, today you have a second chance to become my son-in-law. Verse 22. Then Saul told his men to say to David, the king really likes you, and so do we. Why don't you accept the king's offer and become his son-in-law? Verse 23. When Saul's men said these things to David, he replied, how can a poor man from a humble family afford the bride price for the daughter of a king? Verse 24. When Saul's men reported this back to the king, verse 25, he told them, tell David that all I want for the bride price is 100 Philistines' foreskins. Vengeance on my enemies is all I really want. But what Saul had in mind was that David will be killed in the fight. Verse 26. David was delighted to accept the offer before the time limit expired. Verse 27. he and his men went out and killed 200 Philistines. Then David fulfilled the king's requirement by presenting all their foreskin to him. So Saul gave his daughter Michal to David to be his wife. Verse 28. When Saul realized that the Lord was with David and how much his daughter Michal loved him. Verse 29. Saul became even more afraid of him, and he remained David's enemy for the rest of his life. Verse 30. Every time the commanders of the Philistines attacked, David was more successful against them than all the rest of Saul's officers. So David's name became very famous. Amen.